Have you ever imagined the impact of another country joining the exclusive and dangerous club of nuclear powers? South Korea, with its advanced technology and strategic allies, is closer to this reality than many might think. But the big question is, would this make the world safer or put global security at even greater risk? In this video, we will delve into one of the most urgent and controversial topics of our time: nuclear proliferation. Would South Korea having a nuclear bomb be a strategic move or a disaster waiting to happen? Stay with me until the end to find out how this possibility could shape the future of the balance of power in the world and what it means for you. Don't miss a single second of this content, as what you're about to learn could be a turning point in your current geopolitical knowledge. Take this moment to check if you're already subscribed to the channel, because only by being a subscriber will you receive daily content that keeps you ahead of most people who are less informed. The world's security is at stake, and the time to understand this is now. Subscribe now. Let's dive in. During his confirmation hearing earlier this month, South Korea's defense minister, Lee Jong-sup, argued that acquiring nuclear weapons is among the possible options to respond to North Korea's growing nuclear threat. This is the latest sign that the country is normalizing the idea of becoming a nuclear-armed state. South Korean political leaders often flirt with the idea of denuclearization, but also consider options involving Washington. In recent years, scholars and figures in the national security sector have welcomed this possibility. For example, just a few months ago, former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, "There's no reason to oppose South Korea developing nuclear weapons." Over the past decade, periodic South Korean public opinion polls have consistently found a majority supporting the acquisition of nuclear weapons. However, few seem to discuss the costs this would generate for the country and the world. South Korea's temptation is understandable, given its dual concerns about attacks from increasingly assertive neighbors and the possible abandonment by Washington, especially if former U.S. President Donald Trump returns to power. Perhaps this would even benefit the United States. A South Korea with a nuclear arsenal capable of surviving attacks could shift the burden of dealing with North Korea and free up American resources to contain China. However, before embarking on nuclear proliferation, policymakers in Washington and Seoul must consider 5 critical questions that are being overlooked today. The answers to these questions might suggest that the imagined benefits of nuclear proliferation among allies do not clearly outweigh the risks. Now, let's address the questions and possible answers. The first and most basic question: what would be required for South Korea to obtain a nuclear arsenal capable of surviving an attack? Presumably, Seoul would seek to at least match the size of North Korea's arsenal, which is estimated at about 50 nuclear weapons, plus fuel to quickly produce an additional 20 weapons. Seoul would also want to ensure that its arsenal could survive a first strike by North Korea. After all, this would greatly enhance its deterrence power. But here is where the problems begin. Given South Korea's small size and unique geography, the most viable option would be submarine-based nuclear missiles. However, acquiring submarines capable of carrying such missiles is a costly and time-consuming challenge. Building an arsenal of 100 nuclear weapons and equipping them on submarines, for example, could take 10 or more years, depending on how South Korea chooses to acquire fissile material and deploy the weapons. This would create a long and dangerous window of vulnerability for South Korea, during which its primary adversaries, North Korea and China, would have incentives to attack its nuclear facilities and delay its progress. This brings us to the second question. During this window of vulnerability, the years required for South Korea to build a nuclear deterrent arsenal, should the United States protect it from attacks? Naturally, Seoul would expect its greatest ally to uphold its promises of extended deterrence, the famous nuclear umbrella, and to maintain the American troops stationed there while South Korea builds its arsenal. However, this would place Washington in a difficult position. After decades of trying to prevent South Korea and other countries from acquiring nuclear weapons, the United States would now be asked to risk American lives at a delicate moment to defend a nuclear-armed South Korea, whose acquisition of these weapons should theoretically make U.S. defense unnecessary. It is likely that most of the U.S. Congress and electorate would conclude that a nuclear-armed South Korea should defend itself and that American forces should return home after 72 years on the Korean Peninsula. For context, the United States currently has over 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea, with its largest foreign military base located there. Recently, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, a Trump ally, raised doubts about whether the United States should support South Korea in a war against North Korea. This statement, of course, casts doubt on the credibility of U.S. security and defense promises to allies and partners worldwide. Now, let's move to the third question. Would South Korean nuclear weapons make war in Northeast Asia more likely? And would the United States inevitably be involved? Humanity's short history with nuclear-armed adversaries suggests that the first 10 to 20 years after acquiring such weapons are particularly dangerous. For instance, the United States and the Soviet Union faced nuclear crises in Berlin in 1961 and Cuba in 1962. Another example occurred a few years after Israel acquired nuclear weapons during the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, which triggered a DEFCON 3 alert in the United States, possibly one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. In the most recent case, after Pakistan became nuclear-armed, India and Pakistan fought the Kargil War in 1999 and, following a terrorist attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001, the two countries were once again brought to the brink of war. If South Korea acquires nuclear weapons, it is expected that North Korea and China would try to impose costs on Seoul or prevent it entirely. Meanwhile, South Korean leaders might feel emboldened to take greater risks, as they would have much more at stake. In other words, North Korea and China would have a strong incentive to attack South Korea, aiming to prevent their rival from obtaining the world's most powerful weapon. Conversely, South Korea would also have a strong incentive to build the weapon, as its security would depend solely on itself, especially if the United States and its allies were unwilling to protect it in a nuclear risk scenario. With this, we have both sides incentivized to clash or enter into conflict. By increasing instability, at least initially, South Korean nuclearization would raise the risks of war. It is naive to think that U.S. military forces would not be involved in one way or another. More directly and objectively answering the two questions, yes, this would make Asia more dangerous, and probably or inevitably, the United States would also be involved in such a conflict. Now let's move to the fourth question. Would Washington sanction South Korea if it built a nuclear force? South Korea's nuclearization would place the U.S. president in a difficult position. Sanction a close ally and risk the future of the alliance, or try to bypass sanctions and undermine the United States' ability to prevent future nuclear proliferations elsewhere. If any state, including South Korea, attempts to acquire nuclear weapons, the U.S. government is legally obligated to impose a series of severe economic and military sanctions. The most specific and comprehensive of these legal obligations is the Glenn Amendment, which would terminate foreign assistance, defense sales, and military financing, deny U.S. credits or guarantees, require opposition to multilateral loans, and prohibit certain types of technological exports. Should South Korea attempt to develop a nuclear device, the Glenn Amendment has no waiver clause, meaning that an act of Congress would be required to rescind the sanctions. Seoul might try to avoid sanctions by disguising or hiding its nuclear program, but the chances of evading detection by intelligence services, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, or other investigators for long are extremely low. Given the difficulty of avoiding sanctions, South Korean politicians, business leaders, and voters would need to seriously consider the potential costs of these sanctions more than they have so far. Advocates for nuclear weapons tend to downplay these costs, arguing that South Korea's economy is too important to be sanctioned. However, South Korea's National Security Advisor, Shin Won-sik, recently warned that proliferation would cause, quote, an immediate shock to our financial market, unquote. China would likely also sanction South Korea, as it did in 2016 when Seoul deployed U.S. missile defenses against China's wishes. That move cost the South Korean economy about $7.5 billion. It's reasonable to imagine China adopting an even more punitive approach toward both South Korea and the United States in retaliation for a nuclear program, something much larger and more serious. Beyond China, even if the United States found ways to avoid sanctioning South Korea, European countries and other G20 states might join the sanctions. Alternatively, South Korean leaders and businesspeople could pressure U.S. leaders and Congress to modify non-proliferation laws or exempt South Korea from them. There is a precedent in this story. The George W. Bush administration, for example, made a deal with India in 2005 to allow it to purchase foreign nuclear power plants, preferably American ones. It then spent 3 years negotiating with New Delhi and the US Congress to remove sanctions and other types of legal and political obstacles against India. However, the nuclear deal with India serves as a warning. India did not buy American nuclear reactors nor fully align itself with US efforts to contain China. Thus, there is no certainty that a nuclear-armed South Korea would fulfill any promises made to secure similar favorable treatment. For the US to bypass the sanctions issue, it would need to go through Congress. Given the current political climate in the country, predicting if and how Washington would handle partisan political realities to rewrite non-proliferation legislation is, at best, uncertain. In other words, it would be highly imprudent for South Korea to assume everything would be easy and simple. So let's move to the final question. What would all this mean for preventing further nuclear proliferation worldwide? The fact that there are only 9 nuclear-armed countries today is largely due to the vision of US leaders and their Soviet counterparts from the 1960s, who built a global system to prevent and discourage states from pursuing nuclear weapons. However, if the United States effectively abandoned this system in favor of an exception policy for its allies' proliferation, it wouldn't be hard to imagine other countries going nuclear. Norms and non-proliferation rules could be manipulated to benefit partners like India, Australia, and possibly Saudi Arabia. This would intensify suspicions in China, Russia, and elsewhere that the non-proliferation regime is neither universal nor rule-based, but rather a US tool to contain or weaken its adversaries. If Washington tolerated or even facilitated South Korea's nuclear proliferation, many other countries would join Moscow and Beijing in denouncing it as yet another example of American hypocrisy. China and Russia would then have a powerful incentive and precedent to ignore or even assist American adversaries in acquiring nuclear weapons, rebalancing or balancing the power dynamics. After answering these 5 questions, it becomes clear that it would be very difficult for South Korea to acquire a bomb at a low cost, and this could severely harm the current international order. In conclusion, there are reasonable arguments for South Korea to acquire nuclear weapons, mainly due to the nuclear threats it faces from a hostile North Korea. But there are real dangers in choosing this path. The most complicated period would be the first decade or two, while a newly nuclear-armed South Korea and its adversaries figure out how to manage this new reality. Perhaps the Koreas could navigate this without crises, but the long-standing conflict on the peninsula does not inspire confidence that this will be the case. As we have long observed, an increase in the number of nuclear-armed actors raises the risk of arms races, crises, and nuclear use worldwide. Well, that's today's video. I hope you enjoyed the content, and I invite you to subscribe to the channel to stay updated on global geopolitical events, which are so important today. See you in the next video.